This is Elected, a podcast for women and our active accomplices in and around politics. I'm your host, Sarah Elder-Chamanara, and today my guest is Ayesha Chughtai. In the spirit of reconciliation, it's important for me to share my personal commitment to learning the history of colonialism and the ongoing systemic violence and oppression against Indigenous peoples. The land where I live, work, and record from is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. So, Ayesha, I'm so excited to talk with you because you have done some very incredible things in Canadian politics. And I know that, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So, you just made a big career transition. So you left, you just finished serving as the regional advisor for the Prairies and the North for the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. And you're now working as the manager, government lead of public policy for the Future of Canada, the Future of Canada Center with Deloitte. It's a mouthful.
Yes, it's definitely a mouthful.
Is that all on your business card?
You know what? I haven't actually seen my business card yet. So I wonder, I sometimes I've asked a couple of people, like, what's your, like, how do you explain the center to other people? Because I feel like I do it a different way every time based off of, like, I did a new module and so I learned something new and then I added to my little pit. But I do wonder how other people put it on their cards.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of what people put on their cards, before we started recording, we were talking about our last names and pronunciation. And so I told you a story about an experience I had a few months ago or a couple of months ago where I was at a public event and I was on a panel and the moderator introduced the two people before me. And then he got to me and he said, Sarah Elder. And then he was like, oh, I guess I could have asked you how to pronounce your last name in a room full of people in Calgary. And that kind of like that, it definitely hit something inside of me because I said, yes, you could have, because we'd been sitting at the same table prior to the event starting. He never took the time to introduce himself as the moderator. You know, how do you, like, for people who have names that are, you know, like yours and mine, or anyone who has a name that might not be, you know, easy to pronounce or people have a hard time with, like, how do you deal with that?
Before I start, I actually just want to acknowledge that I'm also I am on unceded Anishinaabe and Algonquin territory in Ottawa. But the journey with the name I find is so interesting because I feel like for me personally, it was this like journey of like coming into myself, because when I was a kid, especially, and I was in school and my name, people would always pronounce my first name even as Ayesha. And I would never correct it, to the point where I would introduce myself as Ayesha. We didn't even get to the last name because that threw everybody off. But even my first name, I used to mispronounce. And it was like well into adulthood, like probably like end of university, into my work life. And even then, like I kind of like tiptoed around it, was when I started to be like, but that's not my name. And it's actually not a difficult name. And I can ask people to pronounce it correctly. And then so I slowly started to like, you know, tell people like, you know, my name is Ayesha, and they'd be like, yeah, Ayesha. And you'd be like, no, and then I like figured out like, what if I say like I, like your eye, it like helps people. And so you sort of work on that. But it was so interesting that there's certain people who would like make a super sincere effort to try to say, you know, my name right, especially if I corrected them. And then there's certain people who would, I would say like, oh, my name is Ayesha, and they'd be like, yes, Ayesha, and then keep going. And it just, to me, said that, you know, I don't actually necessarily have to, I'm going to listen to half of what you have to say, or I'm going to take from it what I want. And I just think it's really you know, when you're in a meeting or you're in a professional context, you're already thinking about so many things, and the added burden of like going into this meeting, debating whether you want to correct someone's pronunciation of your name is just such an unnecessary thing that all of us could just take a second to bother to, to your point, like ask beforehand. It's like, and the thing that I loved about virtual meetings is that I could just put it in my name. I actually just wrote my name out in my Zoom name so that you could pronounce it right. But it's pretty exhausting to think about it all the time. And like, with my last name, I don't even think I'm married. I don't even usually bother like trying to get people to pronounce it right, because I just been raised with this idea that it's a complicated name. People usually try to add an N to it because they think it's an Asian last name. I guess like the way that it looks, it makes people think that. And so sometimes, especially if people only know me through email, they get confused when they meet me. They're like, oh, I was expecting you to be different. And I realized over the years that means they thought I was Asian. But it's definitely a journey. And I think it's something that people can inherently show you that they like care about what you have to say if they make that effort to bother. And if they don't get it right because they're trying and like it's difficult for them, or like, I had somebody from Newfoundland one time, Newfoundland and Labrador, being like, I'm sorry, honey, like I'm really trying here. We just don't get a lot of your names around here. And I appreciated that. Like, she's probably right. I was probably the first Ayesha she'd ever met. And she was like, really like, I'm going to get this right. But was putting so much pressure on herself. And I was like, you just say whatever you can, ma'am. It's okay.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between doing your, like, you can tell when someone is really trying and in their own way, and it's respectful, even if they get it wrong, versus someone just being like, yeah, I just don't know how to say this. I'm like, try clapping it out like Chamanara. Like, yes, there are a lot of A's and it is very long. And I chose to add my husband's, very long Iranian name onto my own. But that also, so the lens that I had, well, this is not at all what I was planning on talking to you about, but that lens of, adding his name onto mine and then having people have trouble pronounce it, but then also it gave me a lens into his name has been his name his entire life. And in Iran, obviously, no one had, it was very easy for everyone to pronounce, but in Canada, that's his daily reality of people trying. And he has to be, well, he's much more forgiving, I think, than I am. I have, we're just also very different people. But, I took his last name, and that's only the experience that I've had since then versus his daily experience of, being not only an immigrant, but having, an accent and that being his name. I chose to take it. That is his name.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's sort of related, but I was just in Halifax, and my partner works at UNESCO, and we attended the National Black Canadian Summit. And we attended this panel on education. And one of the conversations that they had was about, like, one of the speakers told the stat, which I thought was baffling, in that children of immigrants 2 or 3 generations down the line statistically do worse than the immediate second generation. And there's like a whole host of factors as to why that happens. But one of the things that's so interesting for those first generation immigrants and their kids is that some of them discover, in this case, that they're Black when they come to Canada, because they've never had to contest the fact that they're Black when they lived in a predominantly or almost entirely Black community. And so they don't always recognize racism as racism. They just think, oh, I need to get another degree, or I need to like upgrade my skills here, or if I just continue to do more, I'm going to be accepted into the society. And so like their kids will fare better because they just like worked exceptionally hard. Also, Canada obviously accepts like the cream of the crop of immigrants to start with. And so, their kids will do better. But as the generations go on and kids are growing up in Canada, and they're recognizing, oh no, like this has nothing to do with my language or whatever else. I am just being discriminated against because of my race, and some of those factors try to add up. So it's like a very interesting reality into the lived experience of people, especially who immigrate to this country. And I never had thought about the fact that you discover race. And like my family immigrated to Canada, but I was so young that I don't know if I consciously like had that kind of a reckoning. But I'm so curious about now having that conversation with other people of like, when did you discover your race?
Well, it's interesting because last summer I remember having a conversation with my husband around the definition of and the concept of white privilege, and like explaining it to him because he hadn't heard about it before. And we have two children, both of whom are white passing. They look very different from each other, but they both pass as white. And so I was, telling him that, this in the context of, they will have a different experience in Canada than you, because of, what the color, the lightness of the color of their skin. They still have your name, and obviously they're still half Iranian. Or as my husband likes to say, they're actually 100% Iranian because I'm a dual citizen. So on a technicality, they can be defined as 100% Iranian, but and him being like, it was a really eye-opening kind of concept. And he just wasn't, it took him a little bit to kind of process it and to think about it. And because he just hadn't thought about it. And so there's conversations that we have as a couple and as a family that are obviously, unique to us, but not unique to a lot of other families in Canada.
Totally. It's so interesting, especially like in that context of your boys, because of that, there's going to be things that, thankfully for sure that they're not going to experience. But like I have friends who are racialized kids who were born in Canada and who went to school and were put into ESL. And they could speak English perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with them, but there was just this inherent understanding that like kids from immigrant backgrounds, even if they were born here, like their English proficiency won't get the other kid. And so, and like this, I don't actually know how it works, but like back in the day, like it was like English class would start. And so all the immigrant kids, or like all the racialized kids, would then leave the classroom to go to their ESL class. And so it was like this like quite like literal othering of these kids. And because in some of those cases, your parents are immigrants, they like don't question the school system. Like they just think the school system knows best. Like you probably are bad at English, so you need this. And so you grow up with this like internalized belief of like somehow being different, even though like they're like, no, but I like was born in that hospital right there, and I like went to preschool, and I speak English fine. And it was like some of them ran ESL for years, like until grade 3 or 4. They went through this experience and like just never really had anyone question why were these kids being put into ESL when they didn't need it.
Which is interesting because, well, I can totally see. Kids who are born probably in the same hospital, but they have different like racial backgrounds. They've spent their entire lives, going to the same classes. But then, the parents, maybe because of, where they grew up, don't question authority in the same way. And I say this based on my own experience with my husband. We have very different ways of approaching, say, even interactions with the police from each other because of, him growing up in Iran and me growing up in Canada. And so we have two very different lived experiences. And so that obviously feeds into, how we deal with things. And that's just, one small example. Okay, I'll tell you a story that demonstrates my absolute privilege in a different way. So it was last year or the year before. COVID has like made things blur, but all of a sudden, Allie or me, I can't remember, we noticed there was something wrong with the water in our house, and that there was something was off. And then all of a sudden we get a very frantic knock on our door saying, we're with the city of Calgary. There's a water main break on your street. We have to turn off the water. You have 10 minutes to do whatever you need. and then the water's going to be shut off, and we don't know how long it's going to take to get it put back on. So I'm like, okay, sure, no problem. I'm like just thinking, yeah, we can go to the store and get, some water. And that was my approach to it. Allie, meanwhile, is frantically going around the house and filling every single bathtub with water. He is getting every single large pot out of our cupboards and filling them all with water. And I was like, what are you doing? Why? why are you doing this? And he's like very stressed and very panicked. Meanwhile, I'm just like sitting over here being like, we'll just go to the store. And it wasn't until I was like, I was processing, like, why did we have such different responses to this situation? It's because he grew up during the Iran-Iraq war in Iran, where it was normal for the water to be cut off. And that was the first time I had ever experienced not having access to water. And it was just
sorry, I think I just cut up there for a second.
It just was and I was like, that's just one example of how my extreme privilege in some situations has can you imagine? He panicked because he's literally not had access to water, and he knew what to do. And I'm just thinking, I'm just going to go to the store. But you couldn't just do that during a war.
Totally. We just had such a funny, it's so funny that that's your example, because we just had such a similar experience. When we were in Halifax, there was a water main pipe that broke, and our hotel didn't have water when we came in. There were signs everywhere, and it was just like, the water's been cut off. We don't know when it's going to be back. Here's some water bottles. And so we went up, and it was different in our response. But I was just like, I have definitely experienced periods of time where there was no water, because like we had like no central water system. So like this truck used to come and like put water into our pipes. And so like if like they weren't there and you ran out of water early, like you were just like out of luck. There was just no water. It was something that you were like accustomed to. And my partner's experienced that for portions of his life, because he lived in Palestine for a year, and so he's definitely experienced it, but like not as regularly as I would have experienced it, or like it was just a thing that happened. And so like there was like a portion of the night where he was like, aren't you like worried? And I was like, no, the water goes out sometimes. It's just like a lived reality. Like I've been in the shower and the water went out, and like someone had like a bucket that they brought me, and I had to then conservatively like get the shampoo out of my hair. It's like a thing that happens. And so I just like it didn't faze me in the same way. Whereas like he, again, who'd like grown up his entire life in Canada, except for the year he lived in Palestine, was just like, we don't have water, and we don't know when it's going to be back.
Yeah, it was, it's interesting. And we have there's so many moments that we experience as a couple and as a family, that, I wouldn't have otherwise. If we weren't together, I wouldn't have this lens now of my own privilege, and the lens of the things that he experiences, the racism, all those different things. But something else that this conversation, sometimes this happens, actually. We start talking about something and then it kind of just goes on off, not what I had planned. But you have done such amazing things. So working in the Prime Minister's office, and now what you're doing with Deloitte. But we met a long time ago when we were both I was a brand new federal Liberal volunteer, and I think you at the time were working as a regional organizer.
I think so.
And it was on the 2015 federal Liberal campaign here in Calgary. And now it's like 7 years later, multiple election cycles. Actually, I got a Facebook memory yesterday saying that I think yesterday was the 7-year anniversary of that campaign starting, possibly. Anyways,
the unofficial start was like in like June or July. It was an insanely long campaign.
Yeah, that was ridiculously long. And I also have a very fond memory of you giving me way too much of your time, because I was having I had a problem one point after I joined one of the riding associations here, and I had a problem. And you spent like far too long on the phone once trying to like walk me through it, which to me is like just representative of like who you are, and also I think the care that you bring to like every position that you probably have. So how, for anyone who's wondering, to go from your start in politics to working in the prime minister's office, like if someone wants to do if there's another Ayesha listening to this, a young Ayesha, how do they follow in your footsteps?
That's very kind of you. I really appreciate it. It's funny because I've been reflecting, especially when it was like the end of my, I was coming to the end of my tenure at the Prime Minister's office. I was reflecting on all of those things and like when it started and all of those pieces and how long the whole journey really has been since I was working for the party and on. And it's really interesting because I think that it's a very unique experience in that growing up in Calgary, even though I was involved with the party and like I had always like associated with the Liberals, like Ottawa just seemed like this like far away land. And like I just never, it was something that I never associated. I never grew up thinking I would go and live in Ottawa or I would work in Parliament, because I just think that when you live out west, your association with the federal government is so detached. Just geographically, it's just so far that you don't think critically about it in that way. And at that time, especially when I was growing up, we were like, I grew up in the 10 years of the Harper government. So like my conscious awareness of federal politics and in our province, provincial politics was conservative. And so I again, never saw that. And then additionally, like representation wise, right? Like I didn't see a lot of women. I didn't see young people. I didn't see racialized people. And it's interesting because it's possible that behind the scenes and the staff, those folks did exist, but obviously you never see the staff in the forefront. So it was just none of those things I ever thought about. And so even when I got involved in what was the first time I got involved was actually the Prime Minister's leadership campaign in, I think it was like 2013. And it was through Matt. Matt was running the volunteer campaigns, Matt Grant. And he used to, he would hold some of the volunteer like phone banks out of his office downtown. And I was in high school at that time, and it was just really cool to go downtown and go up in this like really high tower, and he would have pizza. So I was like, I'm sold. This seems like the thing for me. And then, when we were volunteering, we would always think, wow, Matt's really cool. He should probably run. Like, I feel like he would be a great candidate. And then, he did. And I got involved with his campaign, which was like almost 2 years before the federal election was called, or a year and a half. It was so early on that he launched his campaign that there was a provincial election in between, and people kept thinking he was a provincial candidate because no one was thinking federal politics at that time. And, sort of I stayed involved with the party. And then the way that I moved to Ottawa was through the Summer Leadership Program, which is an internship that happens annually in Ottawa, and it runs from May to August. And it's not student focused, it's just young people focused, which is a really cool thing about the internship, in that you don't have to be in school. You just have to be available from the months of May 1st to August 30th. So it's what brought me to Ottawa. I actually moved 3 days after I wrote my last final exam of university. And I moved out to Ottawa, and I did this internship. And then I was fortunate that I sort of found additional opportunities and continued on in my political career. But really, like, what it came down to was the fact that in Calgary, we have a really small, but I don't even say small, like I think we have a pretty decent group of folks, but the Liberal team in Calgary and in Alberta is so tight-knit that they really have each other's back. And it's, when I was applying for the internship, I had folks like, who was then my boss when I worked for the party, but Jill White was one of my references, and Jesse Hall was one of my references. And like, these folks were my local Calgary folks who had my back and like then supported me when I moved out to Ottawa, and were so kind and created this welcoming environment. And so I think I was really fortunate in that I had a really cool, kind network to belong to. But I think, getting involved at your local level is sort of the key, I think, if you want to pursue this, because that's where you also actually really learn if this is for you. Because if you don't like it at the local level in your community, in your riding, in your city, then you're probably not in it maybe for the right reasons, but also you probably won't love it in Ottawa when you're far removed from everything as well.
Yeah. Ottawa, obviously, your point about it being far away. That's even like when I grew up in BC, and Victoria is obviously where the legislature is, and even being really political. When people were like, "Oh, like you should consider working in Victoria," I was like, "I will never live on the island," because as someone who grew up in the Lower Mainland or the Fraser Valley, I was like, that is like basically another planet. I would never want to live on an island, even if it was in politics. And yeah, the Ottawa is like literally very far away from Calgary, versus, someone who grows up in, there are just so many people who grow up in Ontario who, who are so intimately involved with politics at a young age. And obviously Ottawa is so close to Toronto. And then there are so many universities. It's like a feeding of like, a chute. Basically, they funnel, people into that environment, whereas it's kind of, we just don't see it here.
No, and it's also like, it's no secret to the fact that like domestic travel in Canada is expensive. And so even when you make it out to Ottawa, it's not like you can go see your family every weekend or even like every couple of months. Sometimes it takes, 6 months, or like you get to see them at Christmas, and your friends and stuff. And so it can become a very alienating experience, especially when you first move out. And it's very common practice for people, especially who work on the Hill, to be from Toronto. And so they'll go home on the weekends, or they'll go home on the long weekends. And unless you have someone you can go to, you're sort of left to your own devices. And like, yeah, I want to see my family too all the time, but I can't. And then you also, in some cases, have to sacrifice vacation, because you spend your vacation going home to see your family, or you spend that money that you would have gone on vacation for to go see your family, which like is great and it's lovely. But also then you start to go, well, my friends all went to Mexico this summer and I went to Calgary in December. So we are not having the same experience in our youth. But I think all of those things is sort of, I think, one of the reasons why we don't see as much. And I'm sure all of this actually applies to East Coasters as well. Really outside of the center of Canada, it's tough to do this for a long time and be so separated from everything that you know. And I think work from home has obviously like dramatically changed that and has made all of that so much easier. And I hope that that's something that stays, where you have, like in this last year, there was a ton of people who joined on to the federal team who were based in other parts of the country. And I think that's fantastic. I actually think that's a great way of doing it. And there's trade-offs, obviously, that come from that, but it's a challenge if you don't have some of those trade-offs to stay for a long time.
Well, I think work from home too, because in order to, have that regional representation in a country as massive as Canada, there should be some kind of flexibility in terms of how do we achieve, that, and how do we change our expectations of, of someone, rather than being in an office in Ottawa, they could be in an office in Iqaluit or in Fort St. John or, Airdrie or wherever it happens to be. And then they can travel, for events or, as an on needed basis, rather than being in Ottawa and then traveling out. It in some ways actually like kind of makes politics more equitable in some ways. But that being said, obviously not everyone is not politically, not on the same page as this. They want to see everyone back in the House, back in Ottawa. But, what's the point of having gone through the last 2+ years if we're not taking any of these, lessons learned with us?
Totally. And I think that like for the most part, our experiences have been obviously so unique as throughout the whole pandemic, because we obviously stayed employed throughout that whole time, and we're offered sort of this mass amount of flexibility, and we're really privileged in that perspective for sure. But I think for the most part, most people are continue to be offered a lot of that flexibility, with like the caveats of like, you know, you have to travel when your boss is traveling, or be in Ottawa certain times of the year and stuff. And some people over the course of time choose to move to Ottawa because they, want to be closer to it all. And there is obviously benefits to being here. There's no doubt about that. But the flexibility remains that instead of going home for a week at Christmas, you can go home and stay at your parents for 3 weeks in March when it's cheaper, and like can still continue to work and contribute to your team. And that is such a great thing for you to have. And I mean, for me, like I have nieces and nephews, and I don't want to miss out on whole years of their lives because I'm working. I want them to know me actively. Kids forget too quickly. So that's been a huge privilege that we had, and thankfully I continue to have in my new job.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then, but you did get to come back during the 2021 election to Calgary, and you worked for George Chahal.
I actually worked for the federal team. I just was based in Calgary.
But you were based in Calgary helping him? Mm-hmm. Got it.
I was working on I was the National Campaign Youth Director, so I was working on the National Youth Campaign. Mm-hmm. But I would go in after sometimes, and I would hang out in the office. And the last week I worked on the campaign, but I was working on the national campaign. I actually got married, so that's why I was in Calgary, because I, in between the election, got married.
Just squeezed it in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I talked with someone recently who just she said, what did she say? Retired, or is detoxing from, she worked for the Doug Ford government in Ontario, but she worked in the portfolios of health and housing over the pandemic, and obviously, which was relentless, and had zero time off, and then finally had to be very firm in taking 2 days off to get engaged. So they had talked about it, but they had to be so super conscious of actually taking that time to go away and actually, do it. It's amazing to see how I don't think it's hard sometimes to live life outside of politics when you're working in politics.
Absolutely. So on the day of my wedding, the morning of, I was getting my hair and makeup done, and my phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was somebody who's a very, very dear colleague and friend who forgot and started just asking me about this thing, and I just started and just went off on it, and then they stopped, and I said, honestly, I could try to help you with this, but I'm getting married in 3.5 hours, so I'm not going to. And they were so emphatically apologetic and whatever else, and it was hilarious. But then they also followed up with me 2 days later to be like, "It's fun. Can you help me with this thing?" Because we were in the midst of a national campaign, and I think that's just the reality of the work that you're in when you work in politics, when you work in the government, is that it's funny. I was telling the story to somebody else, that one of my mentors and who was a former director and now is the deputy chief of staff to the PM, name's Marjorie. She's a person who's always telling us all to take a breath and calm down. And whenever you would be freaking out about something, she would say Ayesha, is Canada on fire? And if the answer was no, she was you need to take a chill pill. It's okay. Nothing is ever, you should never be this freaked out. But in my role, especially with Prairies and North and with wildfire season, sometimes the issue literally was that Canada was on fire. And so you had to deal with it in that moment. And it's this balance that you had, and it's not a balance in any way, shape, or form, because it's really just the sacrifice that your friends and family make to accommodate you. It can be a funeral, it can be a birthday, it can be a celebration. You're going to check your phone and you're going to have to respond to it. One of my wedding vows was quite literally to my partner that I promised to try to finish a story, because I would start a story and then I would pick up my work phone and respond to an email in between it. And he would just be sitting there being I don't understand. Why would you do that? But in my mind, like when my work phone buzz, I have to look at it and I have to respond. And it's a very like, it is definitely unhealthy, but it's, you have this pressure and you recognize I'm in this very privileged spot and people are counting on me and I can't be the reason that the chain broke down. And especially when you're a younger staffer, you want to just consistently show people that I'm here, I'm ready, I'm part of the team, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. But really that is at the sacrifice of your personal life. It doesn't matter what it is.
But I also, you're saying all of this, and I also will say that when I worked in politics, like it was also like I understood at some points that I was sacrificing not seeing my family or, not seeing friends or not, having what are actually healthy boundaries or healthy aspects of my life outside of politics. But like, I loved it. Like I
100%.
loved it. And I was making a choice. Now I look back on it and I think about all of the women I worked with, particularly who either had children while they were working in the legislature or had children or even dads, although it is different, I would say, in my opinion. But I don't know how they did it other than I know that they loved their jobs and they love politics and they also love their families. And it was just about, on any given day, the balance, there is no such thing as, it would be like 60-40, 70-30, or maybe then another day it would be 30-70 or 50, well, never really 50-50. But I think if you love it, you do it and you make the best of it.
Absolutely. Oh, there's no doubt about it that there was, even the most challenging things, like to overcome them is this sense of fulfillment that is so unique. And it's this crash course in life experience that I just don't think other jobs can give you. In the years that I was in politics, I think the things that I've learned, if I worked in the private sector, would have taken me much longer time to experience and to master or learn, and the networks that you build from within it, and the fact that you're the people that you're with, you're all going through this together and you're having this very unique experience that really only you understand, which is why I also think that people in politics build these really close relationships, because no one else gets the experience that you're having in a way that another staffer does. And it's the experiences that you have, they're so cool, right? There's some of the things that I've had the opportunity to be able to do, not short of the fact that the prime minister of this country knows who I am. I think that is something that I never fully acknowledged, was that is really unique and super cool, and something that most people don't get to experience in that way. But it's getting to see some of the PM behind the scenes or other ministers, and building friendships and relationships with them. It's such a cool, unique experience that, I definitely, I don't know if I took it for granted, but I didn't fully acknowledge how unique it was. Walking into, when Center Block was open, just walking into Center Block and just having a pass that allows you to walk into this building. It was such a cool thing to be able to do. And one time I was in Center Block and there was a big group of people and I was wondering what they were doing. And it turned out the president of France was here and he was walking in. And so I was just being held up by the president of France. So it's a very unique experience, and the things you get to work on are so cool and unique. And it's a huge, huge privilege, and it is a thrill. It's definitely a thrill, and almost to the point where when you come out of it, you're it takes some kind of getting used to. I was telling, so in my new job, I had to do all of these introductory modules, and there was so many. I've never experienced such an onboarding, because in politics there really isn't an onboarding. And I just was well, I have to obviously I'm doing this too slow, and so I would do it in the evenings to get through it. And then my manager was like, no, like you were supposed to take your time with this. There's no rush. And I was like, I don't understand this. I don't understand this experience of like, take your time and learn things and like slowly climatize, because I've never been through this before.
Yeah, it is very different. The urgency is not the same. And it's, yeah, it does take a while to like come down off of that. And also realizing, yeah, not everyone has that access of privilege or level. And the networks that you build are obviously unlike any other. And yeah, it's such an incredible experience. And I've never worked for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister definitely doesn't know my name. But you know, like I love that he knows your name.
Yeah, it's really cool. My mom used to tell people that I worked for the Prime Minister, even when I didn't. She just used to say she worked for Justin Trudeau. And so when I actually started working for the Prime Minister, I kind of joked with him that, you know, he made an honest woman of my mom, because she's been telling people that I worked for him for years. And, you know, it was like a really cool thing to be able to share with him. And, you know, when I was leaving, I got to take a couple of minutes to sit down with him and just talk about the experience. And he was obviously so kind and sweet and encouraging. And it was a very, very cool way of ending out my career in politics, for now, at least. And I kind of joked with him about that when I would make my comeback, I would come back as like a senior advisor and like come back with all of this. And he's like, you know, he can't wait. And so I think that just it was a very cool experience. And I think the cooler part of it has been that since then, it's only been about a month, but since then, you know, I've run into ministers here and there, or MPs or staff, and just like chatting with them and still realizing that like, oh, these networks don't just end because you stop working in politics. Like these are relationships that you built that are going to sustain past this. And it's almost like a cooler experience to get to talk to these folks as a private citizen and still know like, oh, I still have this. This is great because I really liked this person and I was hoping they liked me too.
Yeah, you build lifelong networks of people who you have that shared experience with, and yeah, it's a very special environment. And anyone who gets to work in politics, I think is if they don't understand the privilege of what they're doing and that level of access that they have and the responsibility of the jobs that they're in, then they shouldn't be in those positions, or they should seriously consider leaving because of how special of an experience it is. But I also, there was one other thing that we wanted to talk about, which I didn't want to miss out on because of how important I think it was. And that was that we were talking before we started recording about Mariam Monsef and her election. And what people don't, so she lost in the last election, and what people don't understand about what was going on at the same time necessarily, and that lens of intersectionality that we need to apply more to conversations about racialized people in politics. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I had the great privilege of working for Mariam as when she was Minister of Women and Gender Equality, so leading into the last election. I left a couple of months before they ended the election, but it was such a great opportunity. She's someone that I've always really looked up to. I think most people don't know this, but she was the first Muslim cabinet minister in Canadian history, which is like sad a little bit because it happened in 2015, but like, you know, great. But the day the 2021 election was called was the day that Afghanistan fell. And she was obviously, her family is from Afghanistan, and she and her family fled the Taliban. And so, you know, it's something that's not, I haven't really seen covered, in the fact that when she was going through the 2021 election, which was a challenging election to begin with, it was contentious. It was during COVID. It was, you know, it was not a great experience for most people involved, let alone women, let alone racialized women. with the rise of sort of some of the populism that we saw in this election. But on top of all of those things that every candidate was having to deal with, she had to deal with the fact that the country that she had all these aspirations for and that she once called home had fallen to the same people that she and her family had to flee from at some point, and had to do work to help support her community. And people who saw her as their way of getting support were reaching out to her, and she had to help them. And she had to help them in that sense of like, no one was forcing her to, but it was a duty that she felt herself that she had to do. And it's just a level of burden that she had going into this very challenging election that I don't think anyone else really had to that same degree. And you know, when she lost, there's a whole bunch of reasons you could talk about for why she lost. But the reality is that she wasn't able to put her, or even if she was able to put 100% into the election, she was putting 100% and then finding additional percentages to put into this work that she felt responsible to do. And I think that it's the challenge and that a lot of racialized candidates, racialized women have to deal with when they work in these kinds of worlds is that, you know, even when she was minister for women and gender equality and rural economic development, but the Muslim community in Canada also saw her and Minister Hussein as their conduits. The Afghan community saw her. You know, all of these various subgroups that you belong to also see you as their representative and expect you to be there for them, and you don't want to let your communities down, all of those various communities. And so you're constantly having to play these dual, triple roles that you're never really, they're not really acknowledged, and no one really talks about the fact that you are doing this additional work that other people, especially your Caucasian colleagues, are not expected to do, or if they choose to do them, they are often very well regarded for it. I think it's, Minister Holland, famously, he fasts during Ramadan. And it's something that he started with a community organization in his writing, which is like super cool. And his SO31 was retweeted by French Montana, which was super, super cool. But, you know, there's also Muslim members who have always fasted during Ramadan, and no one really cares in that same way that during the summer, they're doing their jobs and also fasting for like most of the day. And, you know, some of these things are not acknowledged in the same way when racialized candidates or racialized members do them and the extra work that they take on. But I think especially during that election, I remember thinking constantly, like, this must be so tough for her. Like, all she probably wants to do is dig in her field and help as many people as she can, but she has to go out and door knock, and she has to go out and do these other things. We also don't know, like, you know, how her own family was dealing with this and the experiences that they were having that were so unique to them. And so I think, you know, that election loss really, it hurt, because I think we as a collective, we faced a huge loss. I think that her contributions to the federal team were, you couldn't really account for all of them because she did so many things. But I just think it was also just it was unfair. You know, she wasn't at the same playing field as everyone else because of what she was additionally doing.
Yeah. And that's something I think we need to like talk more about, obviously, with about, you know, diversity and racialized candidates in politics, and that you do become, you know, the touch point for communities. And in the case of the war in Afghanistan, and to this day, like it has been and is a matter of life and death for some people. And getting out of the country, like literally was, it was a life or death matter. And so I can't even imagine that. And it's something that, I mean, we've talked a lot about Chrystia Freeland in the context of Ukraine and, you know, her role and the incredible things that she did, you know, in her pre-political life, well, still political, obviously, you know, like having a KGB coat, like you know, it was just, but I've never seen any conversations around that and kind of intersectionality around Mariam Monsef and, you know, the war and an election being called at the same time. And so we need to have more of those conversations, I think, because obviously, as much as I wish that that was going to be an isolated incident, it's not, probably. And the experiences of not everyone in the legislature, has the same background. And we want people to have different backgrounds. We also need to acknowledge what those different backgrounds bring, both as what makes it more complicated, but what also makes it absolutely necessary to having them there.
Totally. It's like there, I remember, I think it was in the 2019 session, but we had a couple of midnight sessions. And so they're like, or like 20, I don't know, they were like filibusters or something. And the sessions just like the Conservatives had wanted to do, set up what could have been, I think it was a budget vote. And so you can just vote on as a collective, but they wanted to vote on every item, and it becomes a confidence motion. And so it went, like through the night into the next day, except it was uneven. And so this thing meant that at the time, I think we had 10 liberals who were Muslims, and I think there was a couple and other parties as well. So like, let's say 12 people or whatever didn't get the opportunity to go and celebrate Eid with their families or their communities or whatever else. And, that couldn't happen at Christmas because Christmas is a holiday and everybody is off, or Easter or Thanksgiving and whatever else. But it wasn't really, when we saw the coverage of that, it wasn't really acknowledged that these folks were missing out on their biggest religious holiday because the Conservatives decided to do this thing, because they think that while it's great that we have more representation in the House and we can always do better, but the media coverage and the overall, like, how we look at this all hasn't necessarily changed. We look at it through very specific lenses, and we don't always acknowledge some of these things. And I think that it's important to recognize some of these pieces when we do some of this coverage, or when we see the stories written and see how these things are covered. I think, it's not the same, but like, speaking of the war in Ukraine, when it first started, there was a lot of conversation at the time about the fact that, like, these are civilized people, and they look just like us with their blue eyes, which, all of that language is so triggering for people to hear, because, we are literally choosing sort of which lives we value over others through this coverage. And I don't even always think people mean to say these things in the way that they come out. I think they were just shocked about it. But then also that shock says that it's normalized to see war in certain parts of the world, but it's not normal to see it, which, like, let me tell you, the people in those normalized places would love it if there wasn't war where they live either. But I think it's a very interesting thing for us to, like, be more conscious of and aware of when we're hearing these things, when we're seeing these things, and when we're seeing the coverage, and talk about it so that hopefully it starts to make a bit of a change.
Yeah. And also, I think that just even being aware of it and realizing that these things exist. And to your point, there would never be an overnight session on Christmas or Boxing Day or Easter. There would be a huge outcry. But we have to push back against that as a society, because actually, my preferred political I actually don't believe in overnight sessions. I don't think they should exist. I think they're bad for politics. They're bad for families. They're bad for people. They do nothing except give the appearance of working hard when you're just exhausted. So if we just eliminated them, that would be great. But we have to consider, all of these different things. And also, when we ask people to run, we have to think about the equity and equality of, what they might need, how they can be supported, what it means to be in those roles if and when they win, and how systems and institutions need to literally just update themselves to be more inclusive and to be a better environment for everyone, not just those who have traditionally inhabited those spaces and roles.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, like, again, like, by virtue of some of those folks being elected, they then also do the work of sometimes creating those spaces for others, and which is fantastic. But it has to be deeper than those folks being responsible, because you also want to feel like you're making, just like, the system is changing. It's not beholden to a certain person doing certain things that makes it inclusive for that time period. That there is more of an effort. And I think that one of the things that, like, I became more conscious of, and that I sort of wanted to be taken for granted, was the fact that I would take Eid off. Like, I didn't even want to ask anymore, because you should know Eid is coming, and you should know that I'm not going to work on Eid. And so it was something that, and again, like, I was very lucky and privileged that I worked for folks who understood that. I would put it in my calendar as day off Eid, and that was it. And it wasn't questioned in that way. And I was obviously really fortunate to have that as an experience. But I think things like that make such a difference, because people shouldn't have to choose that, like, they're missing out on something because someone organized, like, a really important meeting, or like major team celebration on the day of your holidays, and now you have to make a choice between one or the other, because the other side doesn't ever have to make those kinds of decisions. Those are great. But we can, like, it doesn't take a lot to do some of these things. It's quite easy, actually, to move the meeting by a day, or just, the really cool thing about Deloitte that I realized is that in your calendar, in my just regular calendar, I think they've covered, like, every denomination of every faith ever, and their days are acknowledged in the calendar. And so I found out that, like, the Muslim New Year had started, not because I'm a good Muslim and I kept track of it. It's because my Deloitte calendar had told me that it was the first day of the Muslim New Year. So I just think, like, things like that don't take a lot from a company to do, but it does allow for everyone to, even if they don't know what that is, you could Google it. You have a Muslim colleague who has a day off. Maybe you sort of put two and two together and you realize that's what it is, and it builds awareness for folks. And, how long would that have really taken them to do?
Yeah. And I feel like as people who, white colleagues need and have to do more to educate themselves, but also be active accomplices in helping create that change, and not just leaving it to the potentially the one Muslim woman in the office to, like, go to be the DEI specialist. Like, that's the responsibility now of everyone. It's just that's the way the world has changed, and that's why I actually in the intro to the podcast I started saying active accomplices, because you can't just be a bystander anymore. You in order for things to change, and to change because we're so far behind, in my opinion, you have to be an active accomplice. You can't just be an ally. You have to be, you can say it is not, you can't just say, oh, I'm an ally. Like, you have to tell me what you're doing.
I saw that you had just listened to Mother Country Radical, and I just listened to it as well. And it's, like, obviously a very extreme version of what that can be, but it was so fascinating to hear that podcast, and especially, spoiler, the last episode, when you hear they talk to these folks about whether they would do it again, recognizing all of what had happened, and what they potentially, and did in some cases, lose out on, like, their children's lives. And I think almost every single one of them said they would, because they believed that what they were doing was right, and that they would never not do the thing that was right. And I think that level of commitment and conviction to something that they could so easily choose to not be a part of, like, they could so actively just live their lives and be totally fine. But for them to think that way and be so committed to that was such an interesting thing. I also just, like, I had never heard of Bernadine Dohrn or Bill Ayers before the podcast. And so it was just also almost, it almost felt conscious that we don't hear stories of great allyship in this way, because like we shouldn't get any ideas of the fact that we can actually work together and dismantle some of these systems. And so I think that the podcast is so interesting, so cool. But just it was almost a world that like I didn't even know that we could have almost until I heard that podcast of people who would be willing to risk their own lives for something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had only heard of Bill Ayers before in the context of the when was it? The 2012 election, was it? Or even the 2008 election when Bill Ayers was brought up as being, associated with Barack Obama and Sarah Palin labeling him a terrorist, which is a very subjective title to give someone. Obviously, that is a very actually controversial opinion. But yeah, how we know people and how that kind of, I had heard of Bill Ayers, but even Zaid Dorn Ayers, or Ayers Dorn, the son who is the host of the podcast. He made that point as well during it, that you heard about my dad, but it was actually my mom who was
right.
like in charge of everything. She was the leader of this movement, but you never heard about her. You just heard about my dad. But to be honest, I mean, there's aspects of what they did that I have different feelings about. But honestly, I feel like Bernadine Dorn I would consider her now a role model. And so, yeah, I've spent a lot of time listening to that podcast, learning more about them and about their children, but also about Chesa Boudin, and because I had heard of. Anyways, it's just, if you don't know what we're talking about, Mother Country Radicals is, I would say, to me, it's probably now my most beloved podcast, in the education that it gave me. But yeah, just if you haven't listened to it, take the time to do it.
And all of the little connections that it builds to various elements, like the connections to the Black Panthers and Fred Hampton and all these other pieces. Yeah, very, very cool.
And I'm about to have a special guest on my very first podcast interruption. This is Ben, and he's not feeling very well right now. Do you want to say hi? Oh, yeah. So I've totally gone over when I said I would, and obviously now mom life calls, as well as other things, and I want you to get on all the things that you're doing today too. Do you want to say goodbye?
Bye.
Oh, Ben. And Ben, this is your first time on a podcast, right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Ayesha. It was lovely catching up with you. I really appreciate the conversation. And maybe we can do another one next year after you've been with the Canada Centre with Deloitte a little bit longer, and we can talk about your work there too.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and giving me your time.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.